This is not a military war, but it may be the most serious economic confrontation between the United States and Canada in decades. In February 2026, a Supreme Court ruling triggered sweeping 15% global tariffs. Within days, political rhetoric escalated. Canada was publicly criticized, trade relationships were strained, and language once considered unthinkable entered mainstream debate. Tonight, we examine what actually happened, what's confirmed policy, what's political messaging, and why this moment matters. On February 24, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling that narrowed certain applications of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA. IEEPA allows the president to regulate commerce during declared national emergencies involving foreign threats. The court did not eliminate the law. However, it clarified that broad trade measures require clear statutory grounding and defined limits. Within days, the administration shifted strategy. Instead of relying primarily on IEEPA, it invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a provision that permits temporary tariffs of up to 15% to address balance of payments concerns. The result was immediate. A 15% tariff was applied across a wide range of imported goods, including products from Canada. This action was officially framed as an economic protection measure designed to strengthen domestic industry and stabilize trade imbalances. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner in goods. The two countries share one of the most integrated economic systems in the world. Automotive manufacturing supply chains cross the border multiple times during production. Canadian crude oil feeds U.S. refineries. Electricity grids connect provinces and American states. Agricultural trade flows daily in both directions. Because the February tariffs were global in scope, Canada was included. There was no country-specific exemption announced at the time. Markets reacted quickly. Manufacturing sectors began recalculating costs. Energy analysts began modeling price shifts. Investors evaluated long-term implications. Shortly after the tariffs were implemented, political rhetoric intensified. In public remarks, former President Donald Trump referenced Canada in language suggesting deep economic dependency, including statements implying that the relationship is so integrated that Canada effectively functions like a 51st state. To be clear, there is no formal annexation proposal. No legislative action has been introduced. No military movement or territorial policy is underway. The language is political. However, rhetoric can influence markets and diplomacy. In negotiation strategy, framing the opposing party as dependent shifts psychological leverage. It signals dominance in narrative terms, even if formal policy remains unchanged. Canadian officials responded by reaffirming sovereignty and emphasizing the importance of mutual respect in trade negotiations. Another justification cited publicly involves border security. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection data, the northern border crossings have increased compared to earlier years. Fentanyl seizures at the northern border remain significantly lower than at the southern border, but year-over-year increases have been recorded. The administration referenced these developments while discussing broader national security concerns tied to trade. Canada has rejected characterizations that it functions as a primary narcotics gateway and pointed to joint enforcement operations between U.S. and Canadian authorities. The data presents a complex picture. While increases have occurred, overall volumes remain comparatively smaller than southern border figures. Nevertheless, the issue entered the economic debate, linking trade measures with security arguments. For decades, North America operated under the assumption that economic integration was stable and predictable. First NAFTA, then CUSMA. Supply chains became interdependent. The February 2026 tariffs disrupted that assumption. Even temporary tariffs introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty affects investment decisions, manufacturing timelines, energy pricing, consumer confidence. When two closely integrated economies impose friction, the ripple effects expand quickly. This is not a collapse, but it is a rupture. The tariffs were the opening move, but what happened next may prove even more significant. Because while Washington escalated its trade posture, Ottawa began evaluating alternatives. and that response could reshape North America's economic future. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not respond with immediate escalation. In his first public statement following the tariff announcement, he emphasized stability. He described Canada's position as firm but measured. There were no dramatic threats, no retaliatory language designed to inflame markets. Instead, he focused on resilience, diversification, and long-term strategic independence. That tone was deliberate. Mark Carney is not simply a political figure. Before entering elected office, he served as Governor of the Bank of Canada and later Governor of the Bank of England. His background is rooted in financial systems, capital markets, and macroeconomic risk management. When confronted with structural economic pressure, his instinct is not confrontation, it is recalibration. Behind the scenes, Canada began accelerating conversations it had already been exploring quietly for years, reducing over-reliance on a single export market. Historically, roughly 70 to 75% of Canadian exports have gone to the United States. That concentration has always carried risk. When the largest buyer changes policy abruptly, the exposure becomes visible. Within weeks of the February tariff announcement, Canadian trade officials confirmed renewed and expanded engagement with Indo-Pacific partners. Delegations were sent to India. High-level economic talks with China were reopened. Discussions with members of the European Union intensified. Southeast Asian trade blocs re-entered priority consideration. None of these engagements, as of this recording, have resulted in finalized replacement agreements that fully offset American demand. That would be unrealistic in the short term. But diversification does not require full replacement to be strategically meaningful. Even partial rebalancing shifts leverage. China remains one of the world's largest importers of energy and industrial raw materials. India's economy continues to expand rapidly, with growing energy demands and infrastructure needs. Canada possesses resources that both markets value: oil, natural gas, uranium, potash, lumber, and critical minerals used in advanced manufacturing. If even a portion of Canadian exports can be redirected toward Asian markets, the structural dependency on the United States decreases incrementally. However, this shift is not simple. Pipeline capacity to Canada's Pacific coast remains limited relative to total production. Liquefied natural gas export infrastructure is expanding, but not yet at full capacity. Shipping routes require contractual certainty. Trade agreements require negotiation time. So this is not an overnight pivot. It is a signal. And signals matter in international economics. Markets do not wait for completion. They respond to credible intent. While public rhetoric between Washington and Ottawa remained controlled, financial analysts began modeling long-term scenarios. Energy companies evaluated alternative buyer contracts. Agricultural exporters reviewed Asian demand forecasts. Provincial governments began assessing exposure by sector. There is another layer to this recalibration: energy interdependence. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States. More than half of U.S. crude imports originate from Canadian fields. Several Northern American states also import Canadian electricity through interconnected grid systems. Natural gas flows south through pipelines that have operated reliably for decades. No Canadian official has publicly threatened to cut off supply. It is important to state that clearly. There is no confirmed policy initiative aimed at halting energy exports to the United States. However, economic analysts frequently discuss what they call the nuclear option in trade disputes. This term does not imply military action. It refers to the most disruptive economic tool available to a state. In Canada's case, energy exports represent that tool. If energy flows were significantly reduced, U.S. gasoline prices would likely rise sharply. Industrial production costs would increase. Electricity markets in certain regions could tighten. Supply chains dependent on stable fuel inputs would face new volatility. But the consequences would not be one-sided. Canada's economy depends heavily on energy revenue. A sudden disruption would impact Canadian employment, provincial budgets, and investor confidence. This is why such measures function primarily as deterrents rather than probable actions. Still, the mere possibility alters negotiation dynamics. At the same time, political messaging within Canada has shifted. Public discourse increasingly frames diversification not as retaliation, but as long-term sovereignty protection. The language emphasizes resilience and independence rather than confrontation. International observers have noted that this dispute reflects broader global trends. Across multiple advanced economies, economic nationalism is rising. Governments are reassessing supply chain dependencies. Strategic industries are being reclassified as national security priorities. In that environment, the U.S. Canada tension is not isolated. It is part of a wider recalibration of global trade norms. Another emerging factor is investor behavior. When two closely integrated economies experience policy friction, capital often pauses. Large-scale investment decisions require predictability. Automotive manufacturers, energy firms, and infrastructure developers operate on multi-year timelines. When tariffs are imposed under temporary legal provisions, uncertainty about renewal or expiration complicates planning. Some American manufacturers have welcomed protective tariffs, arguing they strengthen domestic production. Others warn that higher input costs will reduce competitiveness internationally. Canadian businesses face similar divisions. Certain domestic producers may benefit from reduced U.S. competition, while exporters face immediate barriers. This complexity underscores a central reality. Trade conflicts rarely produce clean winners. They redistribute pressure. As this recalibration unfolds, diplomatic channels remain open. Both governments have publicly affirmed their commitment to dialogue under existing trade frameworks. CUSMA dispute mechanisms remain legally active. There has been no formal withdrawal from the agreement by either side. However, the tone has undeniably shifted from automatic cooperation to strategic caution. If Section 1 represented rupture, the legal and rhetorical escalation, this phase represents repositioning. Canada is not responding with counter-tariffs at equivalent scale, at least not yet. Instead, it is building options. And in geopolitics, optionality is power. But the implications of this confrontation extend beyond North America. Because when two deeply interconnected economies introduce friction, the effects do not remain contained within their borders. Prices move, currency markets adjust, supply chains reroute, inflation pressures shift, and that is where this story expands from a bilateral dispute into a global economic question. Rising trade barriers rarely stay contained between two countries. When a 15% tariff is applied across major import categories, the cost does not disappear. It moves. Importers adjust contracts. Manufacturers revise supply chains. Retailers reassess pricing strategies. Eventually, consumers feel the shift. Economists often describe this dynamic as cost pass-through. When tariffs increase input expenses, a portion of that increase is absorbed by companies, and a portion is passed forward. The ratio depends on market competition, inventory buffers, and currency strength. But historically, broad-based tariffs tend to contribute to price pressure over time. In early projections following the February 2026 measures, several financial institutions modeled moderate inflationary impact if tariffs remain in place for more than 2 quarters. Sectors most exposed include automotive manufacturing, agricultural equipment, electronics components, and energy-intensive industries. In the United States, manufacturers that rely on Canadian steel, aluminum, and intermediate goods are recalculating margins. In Canada, exporters facing reduced U.S. demand are exploring alternative buyers while managing short-term revenue compression. Currency markets have also responded. Periods of tariff escalation often strengthen the domestic currency temporarily due to capital repositioning, but prolonged trade friction can reverse that effect if growth forecasts weaken. The US dollar and Canadian dollar have both experienced volatility as investors reassess risk exposure. Another major question centers on CUSMA, the successor agreement to NAFTA. Legally, the agreement remains in force. There has been no formal notice of withdrawal from either government. Its dispute resolution mechanisms are intact. However, trade agreements rely not only on legal frameworks but on political will. When emergency tariff authorities are used repeatedly, even if technically permissible under domestic law, trading partners may argue that the spirit of cooperative trade has weakened. If disputes escalate, formal arbitration panels under CUSMA could be triggered. That process can take months, sometimes years. Trade agreements rarely collapse overnight. They erode gradually when trust declines faster than legal protections can compensate. Globally, the implications are broader than North America. Europe is monitoring the situation closely, particularly Germany and France, where automotive supply chains intersect with US and Canadian production networks. Asian markets are assessing opportunities to fill gaps if North American trade volumes decline. Commodity exporters are evaluating price movements for oil, natural gas, and agricultural goods. A prolonged tariff environment could contribute to what some analysts call fragmented globalization, a system where trade blocs become more regionally concentrated and politically aligned. This does not mean the end of global trade, but it does imply a shift away from seamless interdependence toward strategic partnerships. Inflation remains a central concern. If tariff-related price increases combine with existing structural pressures, including energy transitions, supply chain diversification, and geopolitical instability elsewhere, consumer prices could remain elevated longer than central banks prefer. Both the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada have maintained cautious language, emphasizing data dependency. Neither institution has indicated that monetary policy decisions will be driven solely by trade disputes. However, sustained tariff pressure complicates inflation forecasting models. Looking ahead to the remainder of 2026, analysts generally outline three plausible trajectories. The first is negotiated stabilization. Under this path, the United States and Canada engage in structured talks addressing trade imbalances, border security coordination, and sector-specific exemptions. Tariffs are reduced incrementally. Markets regain confidence. Supply chains adjust without permanent rupture. The second scenario is managed friction. Tariffs remain in place but become normalized. Businesses adapt through rerouting supply chains and absorbing partial costs. Growth slows modestly but does not contract significantly. Political rhetoric remains sharp, yet institutional cooperation continues beneath the surface. The third scenario is structural divergence. Canada accelerates diversification toward Asia and Europe. The United States doubles down on domestic industrial policy and alternative suppliers. Trade volumes between the two countries decline over multiple years. Integration weakens gradually rather than abruptly. None of these scenarios involve military confrontation. There is no verified evidence of armed escalation or territorial intent. This remains an economic and diplomatic dispute operating within legal frameworks. The language of war reflects political intensity, not armed conflict. What makes this moment historically significant is not the size of the tariff alone. It is the questioning of assumptions. For decades, North American integration was treated as a permanent fixture of the global economy. That permanence is now being reconsidered. If cooperation resumes, this episode may be remembered as a sharp but temporary correction. If divergence accelerates, it could mark the beginning of a more fragmented economic era. The outcome depends on political incentives, public opinion, corporate lobbying influence, and inflation pressures in both countries. Trade disputes rarely produce absolute winners. They tend to redistribute economic burdens while reshaping alliances. For viewers in the United States, Canada, and Europe, the most practical question is simple. How will this affect daily life? The answer depends on duration. Short-term tariffs create volatility. Long-term tariffs reshape industries. As of now, the situation remains fluid. Official diplomatic channels remain open. Economic data continues to evolve. Markets are watching for signals of negotiation or entrenchment. The coming months will reveal whether this episode becomes a recalibration or a redefinition. Thank you for watching Lawpulse News. We focus on verified developments, legal frameworks, and strategic analysis without speculation beyond confirmed facts. If you value in-depth geopolitical reporting grounded in research, subscribe and follow for continuing coverage.